Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julie Lammers, Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy at American Student Assistance. And this is our conversation today about new research released by American Student Assistance and Bellwether Education Partners called Working to Learn and Learning to Work, a state-by-state analysis of high school work-based learning policies. So first, a little housekeeping as we get started. Everyone is in listen mode to prevent disruptions in background noise. If you have technical issues during the webinar, please don't hesitate to send a message through the chat. We are recording today's session, and we will be pausing briefly between sections of the presentation to allow time for people to ask questions. Again, please feel free to do so in the chat. We'll be monitoring that quite regularly. So joining me today is my co-presenter, Kelly Robson, of an associate partner at Bellwether Education Partners. As I said, I am Julie Lammers of American Student Assistance. So just a little bit of background as we get started. I wanted to walk through a little bit just our project overview, our work-based learning evaluation rubric. That Kelly will talk to you about the state-by-state results and some themes and recommendations. So our project overview, actually, let me begin just a little bit of background of ASA and Bellwether Education. So ASA is a nonprofit based in Boston, Massachusetts, but we do work nationally on issues related to college and career readiness. Our focus is really to figure out opportunities for kids to really understand their interests and passions, understand their options prior to graduating from high school, and then helping them transition to the higher education opportunity that is perfect for their unique interests and learning style. Bellwether Education Partners is a nonprofit that's focused on changing education and the life outcomes of underserved students. And they really do this by helping education organizations accelerate their impact by improving policy and practice. So just to level set a little bit about why we launched into this work. So as an organization, ASA really does prioritize work-based learning. And we think that it is necessary to provide these experiences to high school students, help them earn industry credentials while they're in high school, build the technical and interpersonal skills they need to succeed in the workplace, and then provide a pathway into the labor market. All of those things we believe really should be starting at the high school age, and it's not currently happening to a wide degree. ASA undertook a study. It was really right before the pandemic, last March, to understand some basic work-based learning processes and understanding for both high school students and business. And this study found that 79% of students said that they were interested in an internship or other work-based learning experience to help them gain skills or explore career fields, but only 34% of them had ever heard of an available opportunity for high school students. In that same study, we looked at companies and how they are offering experiences for students. And what we found was that the majority of companies don't offer opportunities for high school students. And this is really because they either see no business need, they don't think they have resources internally to support high school interns. They don't believe high schoolers are suited to their particular job field. They are concerned about liability issues. They might have budgetary reasons for not participating in such a program, and other logistical reasons. For example, there may be transportation challenges getting to their work site, or kids that are in high school tend to be in school the same hours that a lot of businesses are open. So how do you help navigate some of those issues? Businesses, however, did say that they would, 71% of them said they would consider expanding work-based learning to high school students if certain conditions were met. If there was an increase in the workload suited for high school age students, for example, or there were specific guidelines that would help them facilitate a process. If there was increased funding available for such opportunities, help with management of interns, or help with recruiting, which seemed to be a big concern. So really looking at what's the role of the state government in helping to facilitate and break down some of these barriers that ASA saw. We reached out to Bellwether to see if we could figure out how states are currently providing an infrastructure for work-based learning for high school students, where the gaps might be, and where we could possibly recommend some changes occur. So we see a number of roles for the state in this process, from creating a strategy, providing coordination, removing some of those barriers that employers saw, providing oversight and accountability, certainly providing access and scale. There's an opportunity for states to provide some funding in this way, and really providing continuity from one state administration to the next. So those are the really the key areas that we were looking to understand a little bit better. And so we launched this initiative with Bellwether Education, uh, and sought to understand those policies. Last week, we released 50 state analysis plus Washington, D.C., of all of the policies that are currently in place that impact high school work-based learning in a variety of different ways. And this report includes an overall summary of our findings, as well as a detailed 240 plus page analysis of what states are doing in each of the categories listed. We certainly won't go through all of those today, but we'll give you a highlights of what that information looks like. So we started off by creating a rubric to assess states' work-based learning policies. We did a lot of desk research to understand those policies, and then the initial research was sent to state leaders. We got responses from 43 states that took an in-depth look at the research that we had provided, updated things as needed, and came back with this final report. So just to level set what it is we are looking at, there's a wide variety of things that can be considered work-based learning. Along the continuum is this idea of career awareness, career exploration, career preparation, and career training, with a variety of different things falling into those buckets. But what we were really looking at is this third area, the career preparation, and really helping kids learn through work. And so that could be a cooperative education experience, an internship, pre-apprenticeship program, anything that really allows them to experience work and to learn through work. Just a caveat to the research, it's really important to know that this was really a snapshot in time. A lot of states are currently working to strengthen and expand these opportunities, and we really did our best to note those where it was relevant. Also, should be noted that a lot of this research was done in the midst of or just before COVID really hit a lot of states hard, and so we didn't really look at what opportunities states might be taking to shift to some of this work during COVID. So what has spurred states' progress to this point? Obviously, from the research that ASA did a number of months ago, it's clear that there's a desire from students, but there are barriers to access from business. However, over the last several years, there's been a huge increase in philanthropy in this area, particularly from JP Morgan Chase and their New Skills for Youth opportunities, which has shed light and really great opportunities for states to focus both resources and attention on expanding these opportunities. And great opportunities from organizations like the National Governors Association and Jobs for the Future Pathways to Prosperity Project that really helped states understand best practices and how they could best roll out these opportunities. In addition, there has been an increase in federal policy and funding that has provided opportunities for states to pass legislation, update their policies, and really encourage more expansion of work-based learning based on sort of some federal guidelines. And so with that, we will go through basically what our rubric was in understanding where states are. And this is a lot of information on one page. We decided to break it down into a number of key sections, whether there was existence of a policy, what the content of that policy was there a funding structure in place, was there a support infrastructure, and then how did states assess both quality and accountability? So in the existing policy section, It really was very simply, does the state define work-based learning in any way for high school students? Was in the content area, is it part of a graduation requirement? How many kids and what types of programs do kids need to be enrolled in order to be eligible for a work-based learning program? So, for example, do kids have to be specifically enrolled um, in a career and technical education program in order to access it? Is there equity of access? So do states specifically design policies to support underserved groups of students? And if there are key barriers, such as some of the liability issues that employers were saying were issues, to have states taken steps to address those issues. The states have financial incentives in place, such as tax credits to incent employer participation. Do they dedicate their federal Perkins funding to support work-based learning? Is there a dedicated source of state funding for work-based learning? In the support area, do they have a support infrastructure in place? Are intermediaries helpful in helping to facilitate and negate some of the issues and concerns that businesses have in running a program? Is there a communications infrastructure in place? And then we looked very carefully at a lot of the quality metrics. So is there a framework in place that holds employers accountable for what is expected in a work-based learning opportunity? Similarly, is there a framework for holding schools and districts accountable? And then how does the state collect and use data to both drive equity and to drive quality? So those were all of the metrics that we looked at on an individual state basis. And then we ranked them, green, yellow, and red. And the ranking is really a judgment call about, do we believe that the current state's policies reflect a desired state for a particular component? Yellow was that they had some of the elements there, but there is still room for improvement. And red really is they have not done a lot in a specific area. So an example of how this looks, so for the definition of what work-based learning is, if this is just an example of what the key high level might be. We see that one state is in the red category because the state does not define work-based learning. If anyone is interested, and I'm always curious as to what the one is, this one particular state is Maine. If in the yellow category for a work-based learning definition, it is that the state defines work-based learning in broad terms, but that it's not does not specify what activities qualify. For example, in this category, the state of New Hampshire falls into this category, and it's because they actually have multiple definitions of work-based learning, depending on whether you're looking at the Department of Education or the Department of Labor. In the green category, if a state has a clear definition that defines activities and experiences and something that really everyone can understand what is meant by a high quality work-based learning experience for a high school age student. We then go into a state highlight of a state that's doing this well, and then just some key insights of why we believe this is important. So that's what that high level criteria looks like. Again, this is similar. This is the one for part of a graduation requirement. And in this category, everyone falls into one category in that work-based learning can count towards credit for graduation, but it's not required for all students. And then we've got an example of how this is a little bit different in a couple of states. For example, beginning in the class of 2023, Oklahoma will actually require students to participate in service learning or work-based learning. Again, student eligibility, this is just how one of those high-level examples is laid out. So I'm now going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Kelly Robson from Bellwether Education Partners, and she's going to walk us through some state-by-state results and some high-level recommendations from the report. So Kelly?
Great, thanks, Julie. So essentially what we did after we put together the rubric that Julie just walked you all through in the rating system is that we went state by state and looked through all of the policies that we could find related to each of the elements on the rubric and rated them red, yellow, or green. And so in the slide deck that we published a couple of weeks ago, it's publicly available, you all can pull this up on our website or on ASA's website. Each state has a 4-slide loop that starts with what you're seeing here for Alabama, with a summary of their green, yellow, and red ratings for each of the criteria on the rubric, and a paragraph or two that explains what they are doing in terms of work-based learning in the state. This is where we voice over if there are planned changes or improvements coming down the pike. We voice those over here. We offer some history, some links to different pieces of legislation that might be useful. If the state has a work-based learning manual where they kind of pull all of the information together, we also link to that on this summary page. The next slide then goes into the detail. Again, it's still broken down in the same order on the rubric that you'll see, but it gives a little bit more information about why the state got a green, a red, or a yellow rating, and again includes links to the sources that we used for that information. So here you can see we rated Alabama green in terms of having a work-based learning definition, because the State Department of Education has a clear definition and has defined multiple types of work-based learning opportunities. We link to the manual where you can find that information. And so we go through each of the different criteria just like this. So you'll see these 3 slides in a row, again, for all 50 states and DC. So I'd encourage you, if you have questions about a particular state, to reference our slide deck. As Julie said, I think it's 200 and something slides. So tons of information in there, all pulled into one place. We are not going to spend time today going through state by state analyses. I really want to spend the time on some of the themes that came up from doing the 50 state analysis, as well as some of the recommendations or considerations that we think states should be thinking about. So there were 6 main themes that our analysis surfaced. The first one is that state approaches to high school work-based learning policies tend to fall into 2 broad buckets. They're either on one end of the spectrum centralized with the state, or on the other end tend to be more decentralized out to districts. I think this is fairly self-explanatory, but essentially what we mean here is states with centralized approaches to work-based learning at the high school level define at the state level the requirements for work-based learning programs. So they say, what are the eligibility requirements? And those eligibility requirements stand across all of the districts. The state defines the data collection procedure and other elements of program implementation. Whereas states on the other end of the spectrum that are a little bit more decentralized may provide some guidance around some of those program contours or suggestions, but the actual implementation decisions are left up to local school districts. And we tended to find that decentralized approach in states that have a strong local control orientation, which I think makes a lot of sense. I will note here, though, that it's the more decentralized the state's approach, the harder it was for us to understand what was happening at the state level. And also, I think it's difficult for the state itself to understand what opportunities students have access to, where they have access, who is participating, et cetera. So that was just one caveat as we were doing this work and kind of trying to wrap our heads around what was happening. Our second theme is that a majority of states have broad eligibility requirements for participation in work-based learning. However, very few states commit to ensuring that every student can access a variety of work-based learning experiences. It was a little trickier than I anticipated to determine the eligibility piece. Work-based learning experiences are frequently embedded in district CTE and career pathways programming. So we kind of had to disentangle who in that state is eligible for CTE, and then within that group of students, who is eligible for work-based learning. Sometimes everyone who is eligible for CTE is eligible for work-based learning, and sometimes there are additional restrictions or requirements in place. Some states, for example, have eligibility requirements that require students that place the work-based learning opportunities in advanced level CTE courses, meaning that students have to take 1 or more prerequisite courses to be able to enroll in that work-based learning opportunity. One of the key things that came up, though, as we were looking at eligibility, we found that 38 states have pretty broad eligibility requirements, but it's really important to note that that is not the same thing as saying all students in those 38 states can access work-based learning opportunities. We didn't really assess the access question in our research, and it's definitely an important one to answer moving forward, but just wanted to make sure it was clear here, and that what we were seeing across states is that eligibility does not equal access. Our third finding was that very few states have developed explicit policies or programs to support high-need high school students, and remove barriers to equitable access and success in work-based learning. So I think it's probably helpful here to talk a little bit about what we were not considering when we were evaluating this metric in our rubric. States have pre-employment transition services for students with disabilities or other programs such as Jobs for America's Graduates that work with high need groups of students and often include work-based learning opportunities. We did not include those kinds of programs in our evaluation of this metric. Those programs have slightly different goals, and what we were looking at was a more focused and narrow look at whether there were policies, programs, or structures specifically designed to ensure high need groups of students can access and succeed in work-based learning. So an example of that in Illinois, the state law requires the Department of Children and Family Services to provide youth in the program, in their care with an apprenticeship stipend to help cover costs associated with entering an apprenticeship. So covering costs for tuition for the classes, to cover costs associated with paying for work clothes or occupation specific tools. So this was we took a pretty narrow look at this particular metric and just wanted to make sure and make that clear. So as you're kind of going through the different states rankings on this metric, you're understanding exactly what we were looking at. Fourth, states commonly leverage federal funds focused on workforce supports to fund work-based learning, while a few states provide state funding and employer incentives specific to work-based learning. So here we looked at both whether states had dedicated their federal Perkins funding specifically to work-based learning. And to assess that, we were looking at whether they had chosen work-based learning participation as a program quality measure in their Perkins plans. And then we were looking at whether they had dedicated state funding specifically to work-based learning. So we were looking at whether there were things like line items in state budgets for work-based learning programs, or whether there were grant opportunities for districts to apply and get some money to expand their work-based learning programs at the district level. And 24 states provide some degree of state funding for work-based learning. We also looked at tax credits, grants, or other opportunities that states provide to incentivize businesses to participate in work-based learning. And 27 states have some sort of incentive in place for businesses. Those tend to be focused on businesses that are participating or operating registered apprenticeships. So they tend to be fairly narrow in scope. However, that's not the case in all states. And some states do have pretty broad programs that support businesses and encourage them to participate in work-based learning. Our fifth finding was that very few states do a good job communicating available work-based learning opportunities. I think this is, again, a pretty straightforward finding here. But most states seem to have embraced a work-based learning coordinator model or something similar. Essentially, they have one person at the school level or at the district level who is responsible for communicating across all stakeholder groups. So students, parents, schools, and employers. And sometimes the states will provide some guidance about what type of outreach might be helpful. But in general, there is a limit to the type of communication and the quantity and the quality of the communication that's going out about work-based learning opportunities, meaning that few students are really able to even hear about opportunities unless they're already in a program that has a work-based learning component to it. States are starting to develop some centralized websites and other things along those lines. So it's definitely kind of one of those in progress pieces, but in general, kind of as a picture in a moment in time, states don't do a great job about communicating work-based learning opportunities. And then finally, many states have not yet set clear quality and accountability expectations or developed systems to collect and use data on high school work-based learning for program improvement. Only about half of states have developed definitions or frameworks that define what quality looks like. We kind of looked at this from two angles. We looked at what states are doing on what we call the program side. So basically, are there definitions in place for what districts should be doing to ensure that they have a quality program in place? So what is the coordinator responsible for? What are students responsible for? How should the program be structured to make sure that students are getting both the classroom time and the work time to get a quality experience? How are the schools assessing students on their experiences? And then we looked at the experience side, which is really the employer side, and have states taken the step to define what a quality work-based learning experience looks like and put in place mechanisms to hold employers accountable for actually offering students quality experiences. And then the data collection piece on that it leaves a little bit to be desired too. I think states definitely collect CTE data for Perkins reporting, but that doesn't necessarily capture all work-based learning courses. And so that's definitely an area where states can improve in terms of what data they collect, making sure they have a comprehensive picture of who's doing what and where, and then using that data to inform program improvement. So I will pause here before we move on to see if there are any questions in the chat.
So I am not seeing any.
I just saw one come through about the research. So essentially what we did, we filled out the rubric on our own using desk research, just kind of what we could find from whatever the state had published on their websites, on the State Department of Ed websites, Department of Workforce Development, Department of Economics websites, things like that. We filled in the rubric ourselves, and then we sent it off to contacts at the state level. And so that was typically if there was someone with the title work-based learning coordinator, director of CTE, we sent it off to those folks and asked for them to take a look at it and provide any feedback, and we made adjustments following that. Yeah, so the connection to Perkins and the incorporation into the CTE programs, yeah, that was definitely part of what we looked at. Most of the work-based, I would say a good portion of the work-based learning programs that we looked at were directly connected to the career and technical education programs. That's typically where they start. States kind of start doing this, and then sometimes they expand outside of the career and technical programs. But in our evaluation, we kind of looked at everything together. So if a state was offering work-based learning through career technical education programming, as well as in general education program, we kind of lumped all of that together. So we didn't split out our assessment to just look at CTE program work-based learning versus other kinds. We tried to be a little bit more holistic in how we were thinking about it.
So we had a question about, it seems the red, yellow, green is a measure of the current status and how supportive current policy. Curious about whether there is also a measure of how much potential there is to grow, develop, expand in states as part of this report. So I think that is sort of the long-term goal. This is intended to be a framework to help states understand where there might be opportunities to expand. And Kelly will go through in this next section where we think states at certain levels of the process really should lean in. And I think, we will certainly be continuing to monitor state progress. As we mentioned, there are, I would say for about half the states, I might be a little off on my numbers, there is work in progress in some of these areas. And so we will be continuing to monitor those and see what progress is made towards sort of changing the coloring of some of these things. Some of them, as you say, was very much a judgment call. They're in the process of doing some things, but not quite at a desired end state. And so we will continue to keep an eye on that progress. I think that's it for now, Kelly, if you want to continue.
Great. Sure. So as we shift to start talking about the recommendations that we included in the report, I want to note that we went through, we rated each of the individual pieces of the rubric for each state, but we did not give an overall rating of each state or any sort of tiers or group states together based on their work-based learning to date. That said, states are definitely in different places and kind of in general, fall along a continuum. with some states being very early, needing to be focused on different things from our perspective than states who are a little bit further in implementation. So I think that states can see themselves probably in maybe more than one of these categories. But in general, these kind of move along a spectrum. And so states that are in the earlier stages of developing work-based learning policies and programs, from our perspective, really need to start with clearly defining what work-based learning means in their state, what quality looks like, and what the expectations are for the various people involved in it. So for the employer, for the student, for the families, and for the school and teachers involved in the program. They need to make sure that there are guidelines to promote widespread access. So again, not just broad eligibility, but really access, and ensure that those policies have some focus on high need groups of students and ensuring that they have equitable access to work-based learning. These states earlier in the implementation should also make sure that there's a diverse pool of employers have the ability to provide work-based learning. They need to look at funding and making sure that there's adequate funding for all parties involved, the students, the schools, and the employers. And they need to start thinking about putting in place strong communications infrastructure so that students can learn about various opportunities. States that are a little bit further along on that continuum that maybe have some work-based learning policies in place, but aren't really sure how well those policies are working for students, should think about making sure that there's a clear definition of quality and related expectations. And if there is one, making sure it's as strong and as concise as necessary and doing some revision if needed. States in this category should start thinking about creating systems to assess and track the quality measures that they developed. Again, focusing on widespread and equitable access for all students. These states can start thinking about, or should start thinking about, the data collection processes, also making sure that as they put in place quality measures, that there are systems to track data against those quality measures, and that they can disaggregate that data across students and across work-based learning programs to start to identify gaps. And again, funding for all parties involved, this is a consistent theme, I think, across all of the different buckets of states, as is ensuring that there's a strong communications infrastructure in place. States that have strong quality standards and data collection processes in place already should start thinking about how they're using that data and making sure that it's being used for program quality improvement. Again, focusing on program implementation and ensuring that it's widespread, that students have equal access regardless of if they're a high need student or if they live in a rural community versus in an urban community, different parts of the state, things like that. And really using the data to inform gaps in implementation and identifying barriers for access, and using that data to help make sure that they're able to address some of those challenges. Again, ensuring adequate funding, strengthening work-based learning communications, and also states that are a little bit further along can also think about work-based learning coordinating infrastructure, such as intermediaries or public-private partnerships that can really own some of the work at a state level and do some of that coordination and communication across the state. And then states that have strong standards in place but don't have widespread access or participation should really use their data to understand where the gaps exist, and in terms of access, in terms of participation, and start thinking about what the barriers are. Is it a funding issue? Is it a transportation issue? Is it that there aren't enough employers who are interested? So that they can adjust policies, put in place incentives to help address whatever those barriers might be. And again, ensuring policies and funding streams encourage and incentivize the universal access. States at this part of the spectrum may also consider adapting some of their the existing work-based learning models into virtual environments to help expand access. And again, continuing to focus on strong communications infrastructure to make sure that students, regardless of where they live in the state, know about the available opportunities in their area. So in summary, I think states are in a really strong position to do a lot on work-based learning to remove some of the barriers that students and employers face and increase participation by focusing on broad and equitable access, ensuring strong coordination across the different entities who are involved, ensuring that there's funding to incentivize participation. And again, that's funding for the schools, for the employers, and for the students, focusing on quality data and measuring outcomes. And then again, I've said a whole bunch of times here in the last couple of minutes, but really focusing on that good communication and making sure that people actually know about the various opportunities that are available to them.
So Kelly, we do have a question that it says, who do you feel has the greatest opportunity in each state to best implement your recommendations to promote high quality work-based statewide? Legislatures, state departments of education, state boards of education. I can take a crack at this, and then if you want to respond as well, I think it varies depending on where states are in the process. I think if the state's need really is a funding issue, it may come down to some legislative support around tax credits or employer incentives, widening the infrastructure that's available. We have seen in the last couple of years some states that have a lot of green on their grids, that there was really a very strong support at the gubernatorial level for a statewide policy. So I'm thinking places like Washington and Rhode Island that have really done a lot in this space, and you'll see a lot of green and a lot of the things that they've done. And it really was because there was a very clear vision at a leadership level that trickled down to all areas, the legislature, the state boards of education, et cetera. So I think some things like definitions or creating infrastructures and frameworks really are probably best managed at the Department of Education level. That's not necessarily something that the legislatures would need to be involved in, but anything that has strong need for funding, whether it's funding a new website, an intermediary, a tax credit, as I said, those things would have to be sort of legislatively driven. So we can certainly, reach out individually if you have other thoughts or questions, Dan, and we can provide you some recommendations on where some of these things happened at various levels of the process. If you want to reach out directly to one of us. But Kelly, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly what I would say. Is it really depends on what the needs are in the state, I think, and who is best positioned and best suited to address them.
We have another question about experience dealing with reporting around Perkins. I don't know if that's something that you have thoughts on, Kelly. I think that's a little bit outside the scope of this. Maybe we can follow up with you directly, Garrett, after this and answer some of your questions. So I guess, let me see. Okay, another question coming in. I think one of the questions that I have as we're looking through this research, as we are releasing this information, I know there are a lot of state entities that are joining us today. I would love to understand how we can best support you in implementing some of this work and helping you better understand this work or articulate it to those around you that need to understand it better. Kelly and I are here certainly to help with that in any way that we can. We have tried to circulate it as far and wide as we can, but we are always looking for more assistance in getting it into the right hands and answering questions of any entity that needs help in understanding it or implementing it in some way. So if we can be helpful to you in your efforts as you communicate it to others, please let us know. Question, is the rubric rolled out to each state? As I said, we did provide this information to the education departments of every state. And I believe in most cases to anyone that sat on an education or workforce committee in each state's legislature. But it would have come from ASA, and them not knowing us, they may not have necessarily responded to the information. So if you would like to share it as well, please do so. And if there are conversations you would like me and Kelly to have with other elected officials or other education officials to help them understand the information a little bit better, either on a very specific state or at large, we are happy to do so. wait one more second, see if there are any other questions. All right, it doesn't look like there are. So again, I am Julie Lammers, of American Student Assistance, and my information is here as well as Kelly's. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions, comments, or concerns. Happy to talk through any and all of this. And as we said, we will be continuing to monitor a lot of these policies, understand how states are adapting as they said they would in some of the conversations that we've had with them, and sort of keeping an eye on how the process is going. So with that, I appreciate you joining us and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.